The night before the funeral, my cousin's words cut me like a blade. An engagement is a once-in-a-lifetime event. Funerals, they can wait. And the next morning, as I stood at the church doors clutching the coffin of the man I loved, I realized she wasn't the only one who believed it. My entire family, my parents, my sister, even my best friend had chosen champagne and diamonds over standing by me in my darkest hour. I remember staring at the rows of empty pews, praying that maybe someone would walk in late repentant, ready to hold me up as the earth swallowed my husband. But no one came. Not one familiar hand reached for mine. The silence inside the church was deafening, broken only by the pastor's voice and the rattle of stained glass in the wind. Outside, I could almost hear laughter rising from across town, the sound of their glasses clinking at my sister's engagement party, while I whispered a vow into the cold air they had chosen their side, and I would never forget. That evening, as I sat in my car with the funeral program torn in my lap, my phone buzzed again and again, 36 missed calls, messages flashing across the screen. "We need to talk now. This isn't what you think. Pick up." Then one from my best friend. "Sorry I couldn't miss it. You understand, right?" Understand. I pressed my head against the seat and let rage bloom beneath my grief. They thought I would collapse, that I would beg for answers. But I decided then I wouldn't chase them. I would wait. And when they came crawling to me, I would be ready with something colder than grief, a plan. The very next morning, the doorbell rang. My mother stood there in the same silk dress she had worn to the party, her hair still perfect, her skin scented with champagne. She didn't come with guilt or comfort, she came with greed. She brushed off my whispered accusation of, "You missed his funeral," with an icy shrug, calling it unfortunate timing, as if burying my husband had been a trivial inconvenience. Then she demanded that we settle some matters, insisting that what my husband left behind our house, his savings, his company shares, should be redistributed to my sister, because I was strong enough to manage without. In that moment, grief hardened into something unyielding inside me. They had abandoned me when I needed them most, and now they wanted to strip away the last pieces of the man who had loved me more than they ever had. I smiled faintly and told her I would think about it. She left relieved, mistaking my calm for surrender. But as her car disappeared down the street, I whispered into the silence, "Not a chance." That night, I opened the lockbox my husband had left behind, his signature etched across every page of the will. He had left everything to me, every dollar, every key, every promise. His last act of trust had become my shield, and if my family thought they could break me, they were about to meet a version of me they had never seen before. The house felt different after that confrontation, as if the walls themselves had absorbed my fury. I wandered through the rooms in silence, my fingers brushing over the furniture my husband and I had chosen together, each piece a reminder of what we had built, what we had shared. His cologne still lingered faintly in the closet, and some nights I caught myself turning my head, half expecting him to walk in and ask why I was still awake. But instead of his voice, there was only the echo of my mother's demands, sharp and greedy, filling the void he had left behind. It wasn't long before the rest of them showed their faces. First, my father. He arrived unannounced, his tone less polished than my mother's, but his words no less cruel. He spoke of family obligations and the bigger picture, telling me that my grief had blinded me to what was fair. Fair. As though it had been fair for me to stand at a graveside alone while they clinked glasses of champagne across town. As though it was fair that I gave my heart to a man who cherished me, only to have my own blood discard me like I was nothing. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply looked him in the eyes and told him I wouldn't be signing anything, and that if he wanted to discuss fairness, he should have shown up to bury his son-in-law. Then came my sister, radiant in the glow of her engagement, her diamond ring flashing as she wagged her finger in my face. She said I was selfish, bitter, that I was trying to ruin her happiness because I was drowning in my own misery. Her words pierced me more deeply than I wanted to admit, but I refused to let her see it. Instead, I asked her one question: when you were toasting champagne at your engagement, did you even think of me standing alone at his grave? Her silence was answer enough, though her eyes glittered with something between guilt and defiance. But perhaps the deepest cut came from my best friend. She finally appeared days too late, holding a bouquet of wilted flowers as though they could erase the fact that she had chosen laughter over loyalty. She muttered something about not knowing what to do about being caught in the middle. But I knew the truth. She hadn't wanted to miss the party, the glamour, the photos that would light up her social media. My pain had been an afterthought. And with that realization, I let her go, not with words, but with silence that told her she no longer had a place in my life. Each encounter was like salt in an open wound, but with every sting I grew stronger. They thought they were breaking me down, but they were only forging me into steel. And through it all, I had one unshakable weapon, my husband's will, clear and precise, leaving everything in my hands. They hadn't counted on his foresight, on his determination to protect me even after death. Still, I knew my family. They weren't going to walk away quietly. Their greed was a beast, and beasts don't stop until they are starved. I could feel the storm building, every phone call I ignored, every letter I left unopened, every relative they sent knocking on my door with pleas wrapped in guilt. They weren't asking for help, they were demanding control. One evening, as the cicadas hummed outside and the air hung thick with summer heat, I sat at my husband's desk and pulled out the documents again. My hands trembled as I read his words, but not from fear, from resolve. He had trusted me to guard what he left behind, to live on in the safety of his love, and I would not fail him. And so I began to prepare, not just for their next visit, but for the war I knew was coming. They thought I was the grieving widow, weak and broken, but I was more than that now. I was a woman with nothing left to lose, and that made me dangerous. The war announced itself with a knock on my door, though it wasn't my parents or my sister this time. It was a man in a suit holding an envelope with the courthouse seal. My stomach tightened as I signed for it, already knowing what it was before I opened it. A petition. My family was contesting the will. They claimed my husband had been coerced, that I had manipulated him into leaving everything to me. Their words crawled across the page like poison, each line twisting the truth into something grotesque. I sat at the kitchen table long after the man left, the papers spread before me, my hands trembling. The rage came slowly at first, then all at once. These people, my blood, had left me to bury my husband alone, and now they were dragging his memory through the mud to feed their greed. I pressed my palms flat against the table, trying to steady myself, but tears still fell, not of weakness, but of betrayal so sharp it felt like it might split me open. The next morning I called a lawyer. A woman named Caroline, recommended by a neighbor who had seen my family coming and going from the house like vultures circling a carcass. When I sat across from her in her office, I expected pity or judgment. Instead, she looked at me with a calm, steady strength. "You're not alone," she said. "You have the law, and you have the truth." For the first time since my husband's death, I felt a flicker of hope. We gathered everything, his will notarized and airtight. The letter he'd written me weeks before his death telling me he wanted me protected. Financial records that showed he had made those choices long before his illness. Piece by piece, we built a wall they couldn't scale. But my family didn't back down. The courtroom became a stage, and they played their parts with venomous skill. My mother wept theatrically, claiming she had only ever wanted what was fair. My father raised his voice, accusing me of being ungrateful, of turning against the very people who had given me life. My sister sat behind them, her diamond ring glinting, her eyes narrowed with barely concealed hatred. When it was my turn, my voice shook at first. I told the judge about the night of the funeral, about the empty pews, about the champagne toasts I could almost hear as I lowered my husband into the earth. I spoke of my mother arriving in her silk dress the next morning, not with condolences, but with demands. I described the lockbox, my husband's careful handwriting, his determination to protect me even in death. And as I spoke, my voice grew steadier, louder, carrying the weight of every wound they had carved into me. By the time I finished, the room was silent. My mother's tears had dried. My father's fury dimmed, my sister's glare faltered. The judge nodded slowly, and in that moment, I knew the truth had been heard. Weeks later, the ruling arrived. The will stood. Everything remained mine, our home, his savings, his shares. My family's petition was denied. They had gambled on my weakness, but instead they had exposed their own greed for the world to see. I sat on the porch that night, the summer air thick and still, and for the first time in months, I felt a strange, quiet peace. I hadn't just defended my husband's legacy, I had defended myself. Against them. Against years of being treated as less. Against the voice in my head that whispered I wasn't enough. But deep inside, I knew it wasn't truly over. People like them don't disappear. They regroup, they scheme, they wait for cracks. I could already sense their desperation morphing into something darker. And though I had won this battle, the war for my freedom was far from finished. The weeks after the ruling were strangely quiet, and that silence unsettled me more than their shouting ever had. I knew my parents too well. They weren't people who accepted defeat. They were the kind who nursed grudges, who twisted wounds into weapons. I kept waiting for the next move, for the next knock on my door. It came not with fists this time, but with whispers. At the grocery store, I felt eyes on me. Neighbors who had once nodded kindly now leaned close to each other, their voices hushed. A friend from church finally told me what was being said, that I had brainwashed my husband, that I had kept him from his family in his final days, that I had turned his death into my payday. Lies, every one of them, but lies planted by people who knew how to make poison sound like truth. I walked home that day with my head high, groceries heavy in my arms, my chest aching with rage. They hadn't just abandoned me at his funeral, they hadn't just dragged me into court, they were trying to erase me from my own life. But what they hadn't counted on was the strength grief had given me. Before all this, I might have crumbled under their accusations, begged for their approval, tried to explain myself. Not anymore. I had stood in a courtroom and spoken my truth. I had looked my parents in the eyes and refused to bend. I wasn't the same daughter they had once controlled. Their next attempt came in the form of my sister. She arrived one afternoon, her engagement ring flashing in the sunlight, her voice dripping with false sweetness. She talked about second chances, about family unity, about doing the right thing. But then, as always, her mask slipped. She accused me of ruining her wedding plans, of tainting her big day with drama. She said I was selfish for holding on to everything while she was starting her new life. I let her speak until her words ran dry. Then I asked her the question that had haunted me since the day of the funeral. When you raised your glass of champagne, did you think of me standing alone by his grave? Her lips parted, but nothing came out. She left in silence, and I knew I had struck the only nerve that mattered, her guilt. Yet even as I pushed them further away, I could feel the weight of what I had lost pressing heavier on me. Some nights I sat by the window with the will in my lap, tracing my husband's handwriting with trembling fingers. His last act had been to protect me, but it also bound me to him in ways that hurt to bear. I wished he were still here to tell me how to move forward, how to keep breathing when the air felt like knives. Still, I began to rebuild. Slowly, piece by piece. I joined a local support group for widows women who had walked through fires of their own. Their stories were different from mine, but the pain was familiar, and in their company I didn't feel so alone. For the first time since the funeral, I laughed, not because the grief was gone, but because it had loosened its grip long enough to let joy slip through. But deep down, I knew my family wasn't finished. Their silence was too sharp, too deliberate. They had lost the house, the savings, the court case, but greed doesn't die. It festers. And I could feel it brewing, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. The moment came on a cold autumn evening when the wind rattled the windows and the house felt lonelier than ever. I was curled on the couch with a blanket when the pounding started on the door. Not a knock pounding. My heart lurched, but I forced myself up, knowing before I even opened it who it would be. My parents stood there, my father's face red with anger, my mother's lips tight as wire. Behind them was my sister. Her arms crossed, her engagement ring flashing under the porch light like a weapon. They didn't ask to come in. They pushed past me, filling the living room with the stench of perfume and resentment. My father was the first to speak, his voice booming through the house. He accused me of destroying the family name, of humiliating them in court. My mother followed her words, dripping with venom, demanding I redistribute what my husband had left me. She called me cruel, heartless, ungrateful. My sister chimed in, saying I had ruined her happiness, that I had taken everything for myself. For a moment I stood frozen, the three of them circling me like predators. But then something inside me snapped. I had buried my husband alone. I had stood in court and defended his memory. I had listened to their lies spread like wildfire through the town. And now they dared to stand in my home demanding more. I straightened my spine and told them the truth they refused to hear. I told them I had begged for their love all my life, only to be met with conditional scraps. I told them their absence at the funeral had been the final proof I needed, that they never saw me as family, only as a means to an end. I told my mother that her silk dress would forever remind me of the night she chose champagne over compassion. I told my father that his lectures about fairness rang hollow when he hadn't been man enough to stand at my husband's grave. And I told my sister that her diamond ring was nothing but a symbol of her own emptiness, because no celebration built on betrayal could last. The room fell silent. My mother's face crumpled. My father's fists clenched. My sister's eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. For the first time, they looked at me not as someone they could manipulate, but as someone they couldn't control. Then I opened the door and told them to leave. My voice didn't shake, my hands didn't tremble. I wasn't begging anymore. I wasn't pleading. I was done. They left in silence, but not without a final glare from my mother, a look that promised this wasn't over. I knew she would find another way to claw at what she believed she was owed, but I also knew I wasn't afraid of her anymore. That night I sat by the window and watched the leaves fall, their brittle bodies carried away by the wind. I thought of my husband, of the love we had built, and I realized something profound. My family had abandoned me, betrayed me, tried to strip me bare, but in their betrayal they had freed me. For the first time, I wasn't living for their approval, their affection, their acceptance. I was living for me. And as I whispered goodnight into the empty room, I felt his presence beside me, steady and strong, reminding me that love, real love, isn't something you beg for. It's something you are given freely. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to cut ties with those who should have loved you most? I'd love to hear your story.